Okay, let's dive into this stack of material you've shared. It looks fascinating, really digging into a fundamental question about the Christian movement.
Yeah, it's all about how God has actually structured the spread of the gospel throughout history.
Right, and what that means for how different bits of the Christian community, like the mission side and the local church side, relate to each other, even now.
Exactly. We're looking at sources that explore that historical development, the structures needed for mission movements.
And especially that dynamic between local churches and what the sources call missionary bands, that tension and partnership.
Hmm.
So our mission for this deep dive, let's try and pull out the really key insight from all this.
Yep.
We want you, the listener, to grasp those big historical shifts, understand the different structures God seems to use.
And crucially, why healthy partnership between them is so important if the gospel is going to keep moving forward.
Yeah, because this isn't just, dusty history. It really shapes how we think about getting involved in mission ourselves right here, right now. So where does this story begin, according to the material? It kicks off, predictably, with Jesus.
Right. Jesus unleashing something the source calls totally new, a missionary movement aimed at the entire world.
Totally new. And the scale and speed described early on, it's pretty staggering.
It really is. Starting at Pentecost, it just explodes. For about 300 years, you see this incredible advance.
We're talking millions of people.
Millions, yeah. Across huge areas, Europe, the Middle East, parts of Asia, Africa, people coming to faith.
And the sources make a point about how this happened, right?
Yes. Significantly, it happened without military force.
Huh?
Completely unlike, how empires usually spread back then. It was unprecedented.
Wow, that speed and spread without coercion. That alone is remarkable. And the material suggests the book of Acts implies this apostolic ministry, this sort of pioneering work. Wasn't just for generation one.
Exactly. The pattern in Acts suggests this kind of mobile frontier ministry is a necessary part of God's plan, meant to continue.
Okay, so you've got this organic, powerful spread for 3 centuries. Then what? The sources point to a major turning point.
Yeah, a really big one. The conversion of Emperor Constantine around 312 AD.
Right, and that changed everything for the church's place in the world.
Fundamentally, it went from persecuted minority to, accepted, even privileged by the state.
So by the end of the 5th century, Christianity is basically the main religion of the Roman Empire.
Pretty much, which meant a huge flood of people joining the church. Power, wealth, respectability.
But the source says there was a downside.
A big one. Lots of moral and spiritual compromise, decline within the institution itself.
Okay, and the reaction to that decline is where it gets really interesting. The sources talk about the rise of monasticism.
Yes, and it wasn't like a top-down initiative from the church leaders.
No.
Quite the opposite initially. It was more of a grassroots, people's movement. Some bishops and clergy actually opposed it at first.
Really. But the material quotes Mark Knoll calling it, the most important institutional event.
And in many ways, the most beneficial institutional event in Christian history, yeah. Second only to Christ's commission itself. That's a huge claim.
Wow. Where did it start?
Out in the deserts, Egypt and Syria, 4th century, you had figures like Anthony living as a hermit around 270 AD, inspiring people.
Just living a simple life.
Initially, yeah. But then Pachomius, around 320 AD, started organizing these folks into actual structured communities. Monasteries.
And this wasn't just about personal holiness.
Not at all. Monasticism became a primary missionary force for over 1,000 years. They were the ones pushing into new areas.
While the main institutional church had kind of settled down.
Yeah, the source says it had made its peace with the world, so the monks often carried that pioneering spark.
Okay, so monasticism fills that gap for centuries. Now let's jump way forward. The Protestant Reformation, 16th century. What happens to mission structures then?
Well, the reformers saw monasticism by that point as deeply corrupt.
Understandably, maybe.
Yeah, and so they abolished the religious orders where they had influence. But here's the catch the sources point out.
What's that?
They got rid of that structure, the main one for organized cross-cultural mission, without really putting anything equivalent in its place.
So a functional gap was created.
Exactly. C.W. Ranson's quote nails this paradox.
Yeah.
They called the church back to apostolic faith, but kind of left the apostolic mission, especially frontier mission, to the Catholics.
That's a really significant point. And the sources list reasons some reformers gave for this. what was it, a 250-year lag in Protestant world missions until William Carey and the Societies?
Yeah, there were several arguments floating around.
Like what?
Well, some thought the Great Commission only applied to the original apostles.
Okay.
Others argued pioneers weren't needed once churches were established somewhere. Mission got redefined very locally, just fulfilling one's calling in everyday life.
So no need for mobile bands.
Right. The thinking was every Christian had his own parish. And the sources even say the whole idea of a roving commission or every believer having a global task was seen by some as subversive to the social order, disruptive.
Wow. That's a world away from how many think today.
It really is. Contrast that with the Arthur Glasser quote in the material.
What does Glasser say?
He basically says, we need these missionary bands until Jesus returns, and there are absolutely no more frontiers left to cross. A totally different urgency.
A stark difference, yeah. Okay, so the Reformation, in a way, lost that structure for frontier work. How did the missionary band idea come back? And how should it relate to the local church now?
Well, first, the sources tackle some common modern errors in thinking about this.
Errors
like the view that local churches are just deadwood, not really serious about mission or making disciples.
Which the sources reject.
Strongly. They say the New Testament just doesn't have a category for a believer who isn't part of a local church community. It's foundational.
Okay, what's the other error?
Seeing mission agencies, these specialized structures, as just God's second best. Like a plan B because the churches aren't doing their job.
And the sources argue against that, too.
Yeah. They point to the New Testament itself. Jesus had a team. Peter had a team. Paul's famous missionary band. It's a biblical pattern.
And history shows.
History shows that breakthroughs into really unreached places rarely happen without some kind of specific, focused structure designed for that pioneering work.
So it's not an either situation.
Exactly. The core argument is that the New Testament and history show two legitimate, God-given structures for mission.
The local church.
And the missionary band. They use Acts 13 Barnabas and Paul being sent out from the church in Antioch as a prime example of this partnership.
Okay, well, what's the key difference between them?
The local church is open to all followers of Jesus in a place. It's inclusive by nature.
Right.
The missionary band, though, requires a second commitment, a specific call to its particular task, usually frontier work. It's restricted to the few called and equipped for that.
Because pioneering is demanding.
Extremely demanding, yeah. Mobile, focus. Paul didn't expect everyone in the church at Ephesus to pack up and join his road team.
He expected the local church to do mission locally.
And partner with his band for the mission beyond their reach.
And historically, the sources say, these breakthroughs often come from these focus groups.
Yeah, and interestingly, often starting on the fringe, not necessarily from the big established church centers, but sometimes with, quote, unrecognized groups of ordinary people.
That is quite a thought. Okay, so two legitimate structures. How should they relate? The sources warn about things going wrong here.
Yes. Two big errors, opposite sides of the same coin. First is control.
Control, meaning
one group trying to run the other. Often it's larger churches or denominations trying to dictate what the mission bands do, maybe because they hold the purse strings or supply the people.
trying to rein them in.
Sometimes, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But control can work the other way, too.
How so?
Mission leaders can settle down, become pastors of the churches they planted, and lose that pioneering edge. They start controlling the established work instead of moving on to plant new work.
The Methodist circuit rider example they used.
Exactly. Great pioneers initially, but lost momentum when they settled into pastoral roles, managing rather than multiplying into new areas.
Okay, so control is one danger. What's the other?
Independence, where one or both just disconnect from the relationship.
So the mission agency might start seeing the local church as less important.
Yeah, maybe seeing church membership as optional for the really committed disciples on their team. They take church support, but inwardly think their agency is where the real action is.
And the source was pretty strong on making disciples without churches.
Called it totally foreign to the scriptures. Discipleship happens in community, in the church.
And churches can become independent too.
Definitely. They refuse to partner beyond their own postcode, maybe lack vision or resources, or they see mission agencies as competition, a threat to their programs or authority.
Okay, so avoid control, avoid independence. What's the healthy alternative?
Interdependence. Expressed as partnership.
Partnership. What does it actually look like?
It means both sides affirm the other is legitimate and bring something unique to the table.
So pioneers focus on unreached fields.
And churches release people, prayer, resources to help them. The band reports back, encourages the sending churches,
And churches focus locally and regionally.
while partnering with bands to go further afield. Critically, neither tries to rule or dominate the other. They collaborate.
Like Paul sought with the churches he planted.
Precisely. That seems to be the model.
This makes sense,
Yeah.
but it leads to a tricky question. If they work so closely, is a missionary band just like a different kind of church?
Good question. The source addresses that directly, and the answer is no.
No, why not?
Because the New Testament never actually calls Paul's team a church. The key distinction again. Local church is open to all believers there. The band is restricted to its specific task force.
And the danger of calling it a church is?
That the band might lose sight of its unique job. They might think we are the church and forget their primary goal is to form new local churches, not just be the team.
Right, clarity of purpose.
Yeah.
But I saw that line in the source that seemed to push back a bit when Paul's team was in a new town.
Yes. It says they'd worship, take the Lord's Supper, study the Word, love each other. How could they not be the church?
Yeah, seems a bit contradictory.
It highlights the nuance. The band isn't the established local church, but it is a real expression of the body of Christ on mission.
Okay.
Think of it like the seed that grows into the new church. Paul's team functioned like a church community because they were the body of Christ together.
So both a band and a church in formation.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
But their goal was always the new indigenous church taking root, not just keeping the team going forever. Apostolic ministry doesn't mean you graduate out of needing the local church. The team members are part of planting and participating in those new churches.
Got it. So the flow is pioneers go in, act as the body, plant the seed, churches get established.
Pioneers move on to the next frontier.
And the established churches then deepen locally and become senders themselves. So the Great Commission applies across the board.
Exactly. The source concludes it's for every disciple, every local church, and every missionary band. All have a part.
And the sources wrap up with some guiding principles for this partnership. God's mission, multiplication, the two structures, distinct roles, self-governing, partnership as God's design.
And that quote about both being subordinate to the gospel itself.
Right. And then they give a modern example.
Yeah, the Movie Network. Formerly CRM Australia, started back in '88. Around 2012, they shifted focus hard towards multiplying disciples and churches everywhere.
Not just overseas.
No, Sydney, London, Bangkok, wherever people are. It's about movements.
And how do they try to live out this partnership idea?
Well, they work closely with local churches for prayer, support, people. They see the whole world, including Australia, as the field.
Their workers act as missionaries.
Making disciples, planting churches, but also partnering with existing churches to train their people to do the same, finding and equipping multipliers.
And they keep that distinction clear.
Critically, yes. New churches planted are local churches, not move churches. Move workers don't become the settled pastors. They're focused on developing local leaders for what they call fourth-generational churches.
Fourth generational, meaning churches that plant churches that plant churches.
Yeah.
That level of multiplication showing real sustainability.
Exactly. Building movements that can keep going. And they even help pioneers coming from churches, especially overseas, set up their own bands as partners, rather than just recruiting them into Movie.
So helping others start their own thing.
Yeah, assisting with training, encouraging local support. It's presented as one example of newer agencies trying to do multiplication and partnership.
Okay, so let's pull this all together for you listening. The sources argue pretty strongly that a sign of the Christian movement's vitality is when new movements for renewal and expansion pop up.
And historically, that seems deeply connected to this healthy, dynamic partnership between mobile bands and local churches.
The bottom line from the material.
Interdependence, not control, not independence, but working together, relying on each other's strengths.
And why does understanding all this matter for you? Well, it's not just history trivia. Knowing about these two structures, how they're meant to work together.
It can help you figure out where you fit in God's mission. Maybe primarily in your local church, maybe something more pioneering.
It helps you evaluate different ministries you see,
Yeah.
appreciate the different ways God works.
And hopefully avoid those traps of either dismissing the local church or seeing mission structures as somehow less important than they are.
So as we finish this deep dive, here's something to chew on, drawing from what we discussed. The sources highlighted that big breakthroughs often started on the fringe, with unrecognized groups of ordinary people. maybe not connected to the main power centers.
Mm.
What might that historical pattern suggest about where God could be working quietly, maybe unexpectedly, to expand his mission in the world today? And is there maybe a nudge for you, perhaps in an unconventional way, to be part of that?
Something to think about.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.